welcome back to another episode of Black Fashion History, the podcast where we celebrate the contributions of Black people all around the world to the fashion industry. And of course, I am your host, Taniqua Martin. And today we have a very special guest and an expert in the African fashion and material culture space. You know that we have been discussing all things African fashion this season. So I'm excited to welcome to the podcast Ken Nimo. Ken is the author of Africa in Fashion and has written a number of articles and contributed to academic journals as well as articles for Vogue.com on the subject matter. So I'm really excited to get into his expertise, hear a little bit about his story, and I know that it's going to be a great conversation. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Thank you, Taniqua. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. Glad to be here.
Well, we're just going to go ahead and jump right into the first question, which I think is going to be apropos. So please share with the audience a little bit about your background from Ghana to South Africa and how these different cultural experiences have influenced your perspective on African fashion.
Thank you. I would say so. I began my journey in fashion sometime back in 2008, soon after I actually sort of got into my first degree. Post my program, I began creating and selling t-shirts. I made these and built a business out of it. At a point in time, I was making clothes for institutions, for schools, and even at a point in time, made T-shirts for the MIT.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so that was my trajectory. But I had not previously studied fashion, and I really wanted to get deeply involved in fashion. So I enrolled on a program and left Ghana in 2016 for South Africa, where I had signed up for a course on fashion. Unknown to me, it was not a fashion design program. It was actually a research-based fashion honors. I really wanted to get in quickly and out as fast as possible. And so I think that's what informed me to choose a 1 year course, which unfortunately was not like a real fashion design, but that itself ushered me into the world of fashion research that birthed my interest in exploring fashion beyond the creative aspect, beyond the aesthetics, to understanding the business of it, to examining and exploring how Africa had shaped and continues to shape fashion globally. In Ghana, Ghana has had a very rich history of fashion, looking back at the works of designers like Kofi Ansan and as they do of shapes, quite a number of incredible designers who had shaped the landscape. There were similarities in terms of how designers had also shaped the landscape in South Africa. Designers like Marianne Fassler, Stone Cherry, these are all incredible designers who used fashion to shape the cultural identity of South Africans, both through the times of apartheid and post apartheid. And so, yes, I saw similarities where designers used fashion to articulate and sort of project identities, but then also to create wealth, where there has been significant designers in the past decade who have created incredible opportunities, not just for themselves, but also for others who are part of the economy of fashion in both countries.
Well, I know you said you didn't intend to go into a course that like led you into research. You were looking for something more in the design aspect, but it looks like you landed exactly where you needed to be, and what kind of helps you grow and learn in your field to kind of contribute to the landscape of African fashion research and history. How did you transition from a degree in economics and statistics to a career in fashion design and then ultimately fashion research?
Originally, like you mentioned, it study economics and mathematics, and this actually goes back to when I enrolled in my senior high school. initially intending to study visual art, but this was actually, I had to abandon that because at the time, and still to a significant degree as we speak, even right now, the creative sector is immensely stigmatized. And I did not see at that point in time what I could do with the visual arts program. And so I sort of transitioned and studied economics and mathematics through up to my university. But the creative urge and the desire to really do something with that talent or that creativity kept up with me. And soon after I left the university, I launched a small business that I also alluded to earlier, creating t-shirts and eventually getting closer and closer to that dream and that aspiration of creating a fashion brand. I remember in 2008, I think that's just a year or two when I had finished my first degree, I did the first fashion show at the University of Cape Coast, and this all by myself, basically putting together a collection, bringing together models, and filling an auditorium, showcasing the work that I had done. But I really wanted to delve deeper into fashion and make my mark in the fashion world. And that's what took me to South Africa. Fast forward, the intention, like I had said earlier, was to just get there as quickly as possible and out, like in a 1 year course. But I had unknowingly signed up for a research degree that took me into the back end or the business side of fashion, which I really felt quite intrigued by. In fact, upon completing the program, I was convinced that Africa didn't need as many designers
Hmm.
as it needed researchers in human capital or specialists within the field of fashion business who would help catapult the designers that were already on the continent into global giants or into global establishments.
No, that's an interesting perspective that led you kind of into honing in more into research. So, I want to ask you a little bit more about that. In what ways did you feel like you can make a greater impact on the industry by being a researcher than by being a designer? Where some people might think either one could make a great impact on the industry.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. So I encountered my first challenge while I was conducting my research for my honors dissertation when I simply couldn't find books that approached fashion on the continent from a business perspective or as a business. There were quite a number of books and resources that approached fashion from the anthropological side. So there were books that explored African material culture, that looked at aesthetics, so basically the works of anthropologists, right? And that explored the cultural dimensions, except none of them was looking at fashion design as a business. And that was a struggle for me. So my research work I had to reference a lot of works that didn't actively speak to the African context. And that itself was one thing that really propelled me. And I felt would have also made a much better impact in terms of projecting and bringing a whole new dimension into the debate or the conversation around African fashion. And I would say at that point, I was quite ahead of my time in the
For
sense that
sure.
fast forward 2018, this relevance, this business and economic relevance of fashion on the continent was really coming to the fore. And we saw conferences. So, for example, the Condé Nast conference, luxury conference, happened in Cape Town in 2018. And this examined Africa at the forefront of luxury. I also had the opportunity to speak. That was the first time that I had published an article for my research at the In Pursuit of Luxury in Cape Town. That also gave me the opportunity to speak and explore the economic potential of fashion in Africa. And coincidentally, when I began my presentation, I asked that question, like to the audience, asking if anyone knew of a brand, of an African brand that just came off the top of their head. And this was, like a conference that had people from all over the world, from Europe, and certainly a handful of people from the continent. And no one could mention a single name. And that spoke to the challenge or the problem, the fact that African fashion was merely explored for its creativity, but not necessarily for its business. And that's what I would say made me really, it sort of deepened my resolve to go down this path as a researcher. Fast forward, for my master's degree, went down the same path, explored African fashion using a business lens, where I explored consumer-based brand equity. So examining how consumers sort of relate or perceive African fashion designers, specifically the South African context. But all of these, as I said earlier, spoke to the fact that there was very little in terms of contextualizing the work of creative fashion designers as catalysts or as conduits for economic development and also as businesses.
No, you are definitely ahead of your time in that because I know people say even today that, there's still so much unexplored territory in terms of research and resources when it comes to African fashion, its impact, material culture, history, all of that. So to think that you've been doing this, since well before 2018, that is amazing. So can you not fast forward a little bit, but as we are delving into the conversation, I would love if you could be able to like put some years or some times around things just so the audience can get an understanding of
Mm.
when you were doing different research. So I love that you shared that the conference is in 2018. But can you share like the time period in which you were pursuing your master's just so we can see how everything lines up?
Yes. So my first honors degree was between 2016 and
Okay.
2017. In between, I took an internship where I worked with a retailer, luxury retailer in South Africa. And then between 2018 and 2020, that's when I did my master's degree. And so even before I did my master's degree, I had published an article and also presented at a conference. In my master's degree was between 2018 and 2020.
Okay.
And between 2020 until now, when I have begun my PhD, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I am at present pursuing my PhD at King's College in London.
Oh, no, I was not aware. Well, we'll be calling you Dr. Nemo very soon. I look forward to that. But those timestamps were extremely helpful because I know like around 2020 in the West is when there was more of a bigger boom in terms of supporting,
Yes,
Black brands,
yes,
African brands, all
exactly.
of that. So,
BLM. All
exactly.
right, yeah.
So the context is helpful to see where all of those things line up. So now I'm gonna say a quote and tell me what this means to you. As the global fashion map is redrawn, Africa is the next big destination.
That code speaks to opportunity and potential. We have seen how fashion has evolved. So, for example, I would just bring your attention to even the title that I used for my book. My book wasn't necessarily African fashion. It was Africa in fashion. And that speaks to contextualizing Africa within the global fashion, the evolution of global fashion, and not necessarily about what was happening on the continent in itself or alone. The world has evolved quite rapidly. The fashion world has evolved quite rapidly. And we have seen the top brands, the big names in the fashion world, emerge mostly from Europe. And this is moving. Eventually, it is going to rest in the continent. The continent is, as we speak right now, bursting with a lot of talent, impressive talent designers who are staking a claim in some of the most remarkable ways. But more importantly, the continent is also evolving into a really viable market that is about what we have seen in the past decade, where there has been some rapid economic development and also some quite significant increase in standards of living. And so the continent itself has become quite a good market where even brands in Europe are already shifting their attention to or moving to. When you go to cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town, Lagos, Accra, you'd see these designers or these brands that were originally in Europe pitching camp in these cities because all of a sudden we have not just the penchant but also the resources to patronize these brands. And this itself also offers an opportunity to designers on the continent who now can have a bit of these resources, who through what we have seen in pop culture, the rising works of these designers across film and music and the arts, generating interest in both local and international designers. And then also the surge of e-commerce sites, technology, like sort of propelling African designers, the works of African designers into the global sphere, where we've seen retailers like Industry Africa or the Folklore, all of these incredible works platforms that are showcasing. Even in the UK, Browns sells products by African designers. And not just that, but also a lot of others in the United States as well. So Africa is at present sort of inspiring a lot of interest and bringing to the forefront creativity that has for a long time eluded the fashion industry. But what is even more important is how these designers are also leveraging sustainability to project and to propel their work. One of the most polluting industries in the world is the fashion industry, and this is post early 20th century when we entered into this fast fashion phase. Nearly every brand, from your basics to your luxury brands, are all culprits of fast fashion. And we're seeing designers on the continent rising to the fore to project sustainable practices, to incorporate things and to project sustainability in a way that has not been seen for a long time. And so this is basically what contextualizes, like that point. But like I said, it's a potential, and the potential needs to be harnessed and shaped into a reality. And that is why I hope that not just the designers themselves, but policy and the business world will rally around to make this potential a reality.
So you mentioned your book, Africa in Fashion, and the importance of focusing on Africa in the context of fashion versus African fashion. And then you kind of shared a little bit about, business practices, globalization, and all of that. During your process of writing your book and researching your book, what are some, I guess, the top insights that you uncovered when it comes to, the continent within the context of the industry, and where it stood at the time of, your book coming out?
At the onset of my research, I did allude to the point earlier that there were books, certainly on African material culture, and yet there was so little in terms of exploring African fashion as a business and as an economic lever. A lot of my interactions with the designers, mostly while I was back in South Africa when I was doing conducting my research, brought me to the realization that these designers were doing incredible stuff that needed to be sort of documented and projected and shared with the world. They were definitely doing things differently, and I felt that it was really important that these stories be captured. Around the time when my book came out, we're also at a point where there was such immense appreciation and, if I should say, allure of not just African fashion, but also of the African material culture. Before you did mention, the euphoria around African culture between 2020 and 2022. My book, by the way, came out in
Yes,
2022,
I have your book.
but amazing, thank you. But between 2020 and 2022, that sense that it was that palpable euphoria around literally everything Africa. We had seen the likes of Black Panther, we had seen Coming to America too, we had seen all these literally shake the global fashion, global, like pop culture globally. But we had also seen even notable brands. For example, 2018, that was actually 2020, the Dior Resort collection that
Yes, yes, yes.
focused almost entirely on Africa, like all of these speaking to the relevance or, of Africa in global fashion. And I believe that that itself sort of really gave me that drive. I also would not be surprised that that itself also encouraged my publishers, to really take a second look and say, well, this is what the entire world is basically looking for. The world is basically looking for alternatives, not just alternatives, but alternatives that were really authentic. And African material culture really um, was what was really authentic and fit the moment.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I do have your book and I've read it, not cover to cover, it's quite extensive, but it was very instrumental for me in learning more about African fashion history because there are not a ton of resources out there that kind of document or even mention some of these historical brands and designers that have contributed to the landscape. And even with you sharing about different textiles and how it migrated to the region, from like different areas through different people groups, all of that information really helped me form a framework of a basis for like the impact of the continent of Africa in fashion in a way that nobody else, or at least not a lot of people, have been talking about even to this day. And so for you to say that your book came out in 2022, which is only 2 years ago, kind of shows how slowly the world is moving when it comes to learning
Yeah,
more about, Africa in the context of fashion. And we have so much more to go, but I certainly appreciate books like yours because, like I said, that is kind of the first time I was starting to see names and like see people that I can kind of look at and look to for like more historical information. And fashion in general is slow
yeah,
when it comes to like documenting and sharing Black contributions around the world, whether that's in the
Yeah.
West, whether that's on the continent, in the diaspora, whatever it is. Fashion is slow to share and to document that. So it's important that we have resources like yours that can take us on that journey and continue to add to our knowledge. And hopefully there'll be a day where the resources are so vast, it's easy for someone to pick up something and to learn
Yeah.
more.
I probably want to chip in something. So it will amaze you that as at the time when my book came out, the most recent book on African fashion was almost a decade old. As at the time my book came out, the most recent book on African fashion was titled New African
Yeah, I
Fashion by
had that
Helen
with by
Jennings.
Jennings,
And
right?
this was in
Yes.
2011. So between 2011 and 2022, no major work of any sort has been done to examine African fashion. So that speaks, I'm just trying to sort of just lay a little bit of flesh on the point you made about the fact that the fashion world, and not just the fashion world, but also even the field of both literature, academic literature, have very little in terms of exploring African fashion. And by the way, up until I think the late 2010, maybe around 2011, when Helen Jennings even explored African fashion, African fashion had previously been confined to art,
Mm.
to the realms of art. So a lot of the books that examined African fashion didn't necessarily go directly, like examine it as a phenomenon, as a standalone phenomenon. They were sort of placed within the context of art. And so the African fashion were looked as they looked at ceremonial clothing, so they would have ceremonial clothing, and they actually even had a term. It was costume. So it took researchers, to really debunk that yes, fashion actually exists in Africa, and that it is not something that's of a Western phenomenon. And so that explains it. It speaks to the fact that we have had a system where fashion has not been ascribed to the continent itself. And that itself speaks volumes, and has also, like shaped how contributions around it has evolved. Personally, I believe that this opportunity to speak to this work, to fashion on the continent, opens up doors on hindsight. And I'm also really excited that I didn't even use the title African fashion. In fact, there is a school of thought that there's no such thing as African fashion. It's African fashions, where we're now beginning to enter into the realms of plurality. We're trying to now break apart, like not just countries, but even indigenous cultures, and to bring into the light the full manifestation of creativity, of culture that is unique nearly every part of the continent that you go to. So yes, I believe that we are on the cusp of something really interesting. We're going to see a lot more works that not just speak to the continent as a whole, but begin to zoom in onto specific cultures and bringing out those very unique, interesting nuances.
I cannot believe that the last book before yours on the topic was the Helen Jennings book. I
Yeah.
purchased that book as well, like a couple years after it came out. And as I mentioned, I have your book also, but I didn't piece together that there's no way in my mind I thought that these were the only two two books available.
And imagine all that had
Right.
happened between 2011
Exactly.
and 2022, right? Like
Yeah, that is
so
that is
much. And all of that was lost.
right.
Virtually.
So hopefully not lost mate. Hopefully someone has been documenting and
Yeah,
they're in the
yeah, yes,
process
yes.
of putting a work together. But thank you for providing that context. That really opens my mind. Like wow, how just unexplored this area is. Now in your book you talk about kind of the migration of African fashion, meaning like how different people groups have impacted, the certain textiles in different regions. Can you discuss the impact of colonization on, indigenous dress and textiles in Africa? And I know that's like probably a loaded question, so condense it
Yeah.
as much as you can.
Perhaps what I would even do is maybe quickly take you to a section of my book where I examine the factors, I call them vectors, that had shaped African fashion or fashion on the continent, of which colonization is one. And we have also previously, like probably examined globalization, but also the cultural, indigenous cultural heritage as well. Colonization is perhaps one of the most impactful sort of phenomenon that had shaped the trajectory of Africa's fashion, like how fashion has evolved on the continent. First of all, it's introduced a vast frame of reference, a much wider frame of reference in terms of the products that came through the era or the period of colonization on the continent abound. Product of all forms, especially when it came to fashion, and products that ordinarily took longer to reach the continent through this trans Saharan trade now got in a lot quicker and in even much bigger quantities. Remember that it also coined that period, that era also coincides with the Industrial Revolution, um, just around the 18th century, when there was also the emergence of the infamous wax print, which almost now symbolizes, has become a symbol of African fashion. All of these were sort of catalyzed or were propelled by the activities of colonization. Colonization also had a harmful impact. So, for example, I would probably use a very specific example. The British had what we call the cotton imperialism, and cotton imperialism basically was using fashion or clothing, stifling the indigenous industry while promoting and projecting imports that were coming from Manchester. So that's how come the so-called African print became that popular. For these prints to survive and dominate, they had to literally stamp out indigenous industries. In Nigeria, there were, and I speak about this in my book, there were areas, a place called Igala, that had such vibrant textile industry that it took them nearly 100 years, at least 50 years post the inception of the slave trade for them before they ever got involved in the slave trade. Why? Because it was more profitable trading cloth, exporting cloth, locally indigenous factories like indigenous manufacturers. It was more profitable selling cloth than selling slaves. So that speaks to the way that the pernicious impact of colonization, where cotton imperialism became a conduit of literally extinguishing indigenous textile industry. So it did have those, but then also at the same time, it had its own benefits. So it was basically a dual sort of a double-edged impact, where we saw how the clothing or the sartorial, how people dressed and expressed themselves immensely shift or change. You saw dress shirts, you saw colonizers or the colonial masters using avenues such as religion, for example. Christian converts were given European clothes
Mm.
as an incentive, and everybody wanted to look the way that these Christian converts were looking. In fact, the names such as the Kaaba, so the word Kaaba actually is a corruption of the English word to cover. And
Mm.
kaba is a very popular dress style amongst Ghanaians. They call it kaba and slits. So basically, what they did was adapting the colonial way of dressing, where the idea was covering up, particularly amongst the missionaries who encouraged people to dress full, head on from top to down, covering virtually every part of themselves. And they adapted it using imitation wax prints. That's basically what, like sort of evolved into the word kaba. And all of this. So you see traces of all of these influences, both the negative and the positive. To some degree, it shaped, it really propelled, placed at the disposal not just resources, materials, even technology, and how to do certain things in terms of fashion. But then at the same time, it undermined the development of indigenous textiles and perhaps what fashion would have looked on the African continent.
How do you see like contemporary designers from the continent now reclaiming some of those indigenous like practices and textiles?
I'm intrigued by works of designers such as Kente Gentleman. He basically reimagines the kente cloth and creates these very fascinating suits. Really, really beautiful stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
But not just his work, but in other parts of the continent in Southern Africa, you have designers such as Tebi Magugu, you have designers Lucanio in Dingue, who uses or explores merino wool and combines them, creates such impressive textiles. We have Kenneth Easy in Nigeria, who also, like examines or explores, indigenous textiles. There is a resurgence of designers who are reinterpreting the African culture, examining specifically focusing on these endangered, traditions and crafts and modernizing them in a way that they are a lot more appealing to not just the African context or local markets, but also the global market as well. So that means maybe experimenting with certain kinds of tones and colors that ordinarily would have been confined to the African context. But also, and that's in the aspect of material, like the actual
Mhm.
materials. You've also seen designers also leverage stories that examine folklore and certain kinds of intangible cultural heritage
Mhm.
to propel their work. With that, somebody like Tebi Magugu comes to mind. You've seen the designers actually evolve. In fact, some even indirectly reference. We in research we call that like derivatively. So like derivatives of the African culture heritage, where a designer like Ajabing, a Ghanaian designer, would reference African Ghanaian culture, not necessarily using any of these textiles, but referencing a specific era, colonial era, where there was a way that they dressed. There were these, like nuancing how African designers interact or relate to their culture. And that for me is what really sort of intrigues me. We have moved from an era where it was almost entirely predictable, or like you could reduce African designers. There was this reductive understanding of what African design was. It had to be print. Today, that the conversation is different, where designers are utilizing the continent's, like rich resources, heritage, culture, heritage, to project the continent. Some are also have also succeeded in establishing very viable, very vibrant social enterprises. One that comes to mind is Akwesio Kumi, AAKS Backs,
Mm.
whose work empowers women, and not just women, but also displaced women and migrants, who are fleeing war in parts of the continent. And so you see how, like I said previously, these designers are taking up space in not just projecting and preserving their heritage, but also pushing the debate around sustainability, social inclusion, and development forward.
Yeah, and I think some of your examples also speak to like the globalization of fashion as well. Like I know
Yes,
like the AAKS bags, they're sold like Madewell and all of these other kind of big name department stores or stores that are
yes.
readily available to people outside um, the continent, and that kind of just makes the fashion more accessible and starts to integrate it into this larger global conversation. But piggybacking off of your response, I did want you to share, like, in what ways have you seen Africa's cultural heritage or seen the influence of Africa's cultural heritage in like non-African brands or brands started by non-African designers?
Well, the influence of African culture and African aesthetics on designers in especially in non-African context goes way back, and ordinarily they've actually been waves that have been built on, sometimes events. For example, when an Egyptian governor, gifted uh, a French emperor, like gifted him a giraffe, it sparked an entire, like, if I should say, euphoria that basically sort of brought the giraffe print
Uh-huh.
into vogue,
Did not know that.
and then there is also the time when the tomb of Tutankhamun was discovered. It literally transformed the entire world. They called it Tutmania, where virtually everywhere. This is not something that happened in on the continent in Africa, all of Europe. But then you've also seen even the father of couture, Poiret, all of these designers, and then also designers like Yves Saint Laurent, who consistently placed Africa at the center of their work. We can't forget the recent work that I mentioned about the Dior collection, where like the African prints, Maria Grazia basically referenced the African prints and like delving into that heritage of that interaction between Africa and Europe and Asia, you know, leveraging that to create an entire collection, right? And all of these have been light bulb moments that has positioned that has brought African, what you call it, fashion in that global context. Yeah, I mean, basically, there is a lot. I mean, and I know that even at present, there are so many designers and brands that are leveraging or examining or exploring African fashion or African material culture and integrating and incorporating them. A lot of the times, some border on cultural appropriation because they do not adequately reference or they do not adequately even compensate, like these sort of cultures that they sort of like take from. And that itself, I believe, is under conversation that hopefully when we have the opportunity we can explore. But yes, there has been numerous times and occasions where Africa has been at the heart and center. And this has also been propelled in recent times. We saw it like I mentioned, in pop culture. Incredible artists like Beyonce, the Lion King, the sequel, and all of these things. The sequel to the with Coming to America, all of these, placing African fashion outside into the much broader consciousness of people around the world.
Yeah, you give plenty of examples. As you continue on your studies, your PhD, and I'm sure looking forward to more articles, more books. What is your hope for the impact of your work in fashion? What do you hope for it to produce?
So first, I believe that the the book and then the articles that I have previously published and ones that I'm at present working on are all evidence of what I believe is possible with my career. But also, I believe that there is an opportunity to explore even in greater depth. And as I alluded to earlier, moving away from the whole to actually dissecting and bringing out far more nuances to the conversation around fashion that is coming out of the continent. I see myself definitely researching and contributing to this field, particularly this realm of literature. But then also, I hope that I will be in a position to also speak to policy, because what I found really, really important and lacking is the fact that there is no shortage of talent and creativity of designers. What is lacking is the absence of policies and frameworks that are able to support. Remember the point I made about potential, adequately harnessing this potential and making it a reality so that, yes, Africa is the next destination of global fashion. And that's where, as a researcher, I believe that my power lies being able to sort of communicate and enter into certain spaces where your work is able to influence policy because we need the right people to be listening. We need people who have the authority, whether it's leaders, whether it's people in ministries and positions that are able to shape policies that both protect and empower these designers is really crucial. So basically, that's one area that I believe I will make an impact. And of course, I want to also see a lot more books written on African fashion by Africans. I want to see a book on Nigerian fashion written by a Nigerian who understands the nuances much more than I do. I want to see books come in and I want to see our reports, whether it's a report by the UN or any of these agencies that border on African material culture led by Africans because we do have that potential. We need to be given these platforms, and I believe that I am placing myself in a position to lead some of these conversations.
Absolutely. Well, Ken, it was a great conversation. I want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing so much of your expertise, a lot of nuggets of wisdom, pieces of history that I know I'm going to go back and look up and dig into more deeply. So thank you so much for that. And before we get out of here, I want to give you the opportunity to please share with my audience wherever they can find you online and, where they can support you and keep up with all of your next moves so that they can buy, the books that are coming out, read the articles that you've already written, all of that good stuff.
Thank you. I am primarily on Instagram. That's, I would say, my primary social media handle. There is a handle also for Africa in Fashion. That is the book, and they can also learn more about my work at the website of Africa in Fashion. That is www.africainfashion.com, where they can learn a lot more about What I do have a blog post as well that examines different aspects of African fashion, like basically deepening those nuances and those interesting
Okay,
conversations.
well, thank you again. Everyone, make sure to follow Ken on all his platforms, buy the book, and do everything that you can to support Africans telling the story of Africa in fashion.
Thank you so much, Taniqua, for having me.
And that's it, guys. Make sure you check the show notes for a direct link to all of the resources that I use for today's episode. If you love today's episode or any episode, make sure to give us a 5-star review on Apple. It takes you all of 2 seconds, but it really, really counts towards helping this show reach more people and more Black fashion enthusiasts like you. And if you haven't done so already, follow us on all social media at Black Fashion History Podcast so you can keep up with all things Black fashion history. And the most important thing, if you do nothing else, come back next week and join me for another riveting installment of Black Fashion History.